In the heart of the American frontier, where dust storms could swallow a man whole and the land stretched endlessly into mystery, two worlds collided with the force of thunder. One man held the power to destroy everything another had built, yet what he didn't know would change the course of history. This is the true story of a rancher who discovered that the greatest weapons in life aren't always found in a gun holster, but sometimes hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment of truth. When that moment came, it would freeze an entire nation in shock. The sun hung low over the prairie like a dying ember, casting long shadows across the McCready Ranch. The year was 1887, and the American West was transforming in ways nobody could have predicted. The free-roaming days were ending. The rail lines were spreading like veins across the continent, and the old order of things was crumbling beneath the weight of progress and power. Jacob McCready stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching the dust settle on the horizon. He was a man of 62 years, with weathered skin that told the story of 4 decades working this unforgiving land. His hands were calloused and strong, his eyes sharp as a hawk's, yet there was a weariness in him that went deeper than physical fatigue. It was the weariness of a man who had fought harder than most and won less than he deserved. The ranch had been his life. Every acre, every head of cattle, every fence post represented a piece of his soul that he had poured into this place. He had built it from nothing, starting with a single claim in 1847 when the West was truly wild. He had survived droughts, blizzards, cattle rustlers, and the constant threat of conflict with the local Native American tribes. But he had persevered, and his determination had transformed the McCready Ranch into one of the most productive operations in the entire territory. His son, Thomas, should have inherited this legacy. Thomas was born in this house, had grown up riding across these plains, and had learned every skill necessary to maintain and expand the family holdings. But Thomas had died 5 years ago in a riding accident, leaving Jacob alone with his grief and his vast empire. His daughter Sarah had married and moved to San Francisco, where her husband worked in banking. She had little interest in the ranch and even less desire to return to the frontier life she had fled as soon as she was old enough. So Jacob managed the ranch alone, with the help of a small crew of trusted hands. They worked the cattle, maintained the fences, and kept the operation running smoothly. But Jacob knew that he wouldn't live forever. He was already older than most men of his generation, and his heart had been giving him trouble. He had started to wonder about the future, about what would become of the McCready Ranch after he was gone. These worries were the least of his concerns now. 3 weeks ago, a letter had arrived that had changed everything. The letter came from a man named Charles Whitmore, who controlled the Northern Railroad expansion for the Union Pacific. Whitmore was a powerful man, the kind of man who moved mountains with a signature and destroyed lives with a casual word. He had been born to wealth and had only increased his fortune through shrewd business dealings, and if the rumors were true, through manipulation and threats. He wanted the McCready Ranch, or more specifically, he wanted the water rights that came with it. A river ran through the eastern edge of Jacob's property, water that was worth more than gold in this arid region. Whitmore needed that water to support the railroad settlement he was building 60 miles north. Without access to that water, his entire development would fail. With it, he would become even wealthier and more powerful than he already was. Jacob had refused him. He had refused politely, but firmly. The ranch and the water that sustained it had been in his family for generations. It wasn't for sale at any price. He had built something meaningful here, something that would outlast him, and he wasn't about to surrender it to a corporate railroad man who saw the West only as a source of profit. Whitmore's response had been the letter that now sat on Jacob's desk inside the house, its words burned into his memory. The letter outlined an ultimatum. Whitmore was prepared to offer a substantial amount of money for the ranch, more money than Jacob could make in 10 years of operation. It was a generous offer, the kind that most men would have accepted immediately. But if Jacob refused, Whitmore promised that he would use his considerable influence to ensure that the ranch failed. He would convince the local government to raise taxes on the property to impossible levels. He would use his railroad connections to prevent Jacob from accessing markets for his cattle. He would spread rumors that the McCready brand was diseased and unsafe. He would do everything in his power to make it impossible for the ranch to survive. And he would do it slowly, deliberately, ensuring that Jacob watched everything he had built crumble piece by piece. The letter was signed with Whitmore's distinctive flourish, and it included a final line that Jacob would never forget. "You have 30 days to accept my offer. After that, I will begin the process of destruction. Nothing you have can withstand the force I am prepared to bring against you." Jacob had read that letter 100 times. He had raged against it, had considered violence, had thought about simply accepting the offer and retiring to San Francisco with his daughter. But deep in his core, in the part of him that had survived 4 decades in the wilderness, Jacob McCready was not a man who surrendered. He was a man who fought. The problem was, he didn't know how to fight this particular enemy. Whitmore had power that extended far beyond the ranch, power that reached into government offices and corporate boardrooms. Jacob was a rancher, not a political operative. He had never been good at maneuvering in the world of high finance and bureaucratic influence. That world had always seemed foreign to him, full of lies and deception that he found distasteful. But something had happened 2 days ago that changed everything. A man had arrived at the ranch, riding in from the north on a horse that looked like it had been pushed to the limit. The man was Native American, tall and lean, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His name was Three Feathers, and he was a scout for the Cheyenne Nation. More importantly, he had information. Three Feathers had found Jacob working near the main corral. He had introduced himself without preamble, stating his business directly and honestly, the way of his people. He told Jacob that he had come because of a debt owed to Jacob by Three Feathers' people. Many years ago, before Thomas was born, Jacob had saved the life of Three Feathers' father during a particularly harsh winter. The old man had been injured and lost, and Jacob had found him, brought him to the ranch, nursed him back to health, and sent him on his way with supplies. The old man had never forgotten that kindness. It was not something that was often extended to Native Americans in those days. When the old chief had died, he had passed the debt down to his son, and Three Feathers had honored that obligation by seeking out Jacob to warn him. Whitmore's plan was more sinister than Jacob had realized. The railroad magnate wasn't just trying to buy the ranch. He was planning something far more ambitious and far more destructive. Whitmore had made a deal with a man named General Harold Blackthorne, a corrupt military officer who commanded the territorial forces. Together, they had orchestrated a scheme to provoke a conflict with the Cheyenne Nation that still maintained territories in the region. The idea was simple and brutal. Whitmore would use Blackthorne's military forces to stage false attacks on settlers in the area, attacks that would be blamed on the Cheyenne. The resulting outrage would justify a massive military response, a campaign that would drive the Native Americans from their remaining lands. Once the territories were cleared, Whitmore would be able to expand his railroad and development schemes without any interference from the tribal nations. But there was another part to the plan that affected Jacob directly. Blackthorne intended to use the false attacks as cover for stealing the best horses in the region, including the prized McCready herd that Jacob had spent years breeding. The horses would be sold to various military outposts under the table, providing profit for both Blackthorne and Whitmore. When Jacob objected, as he certainly would, they would simply arrest him for allegedly selling horses to hostile Indians. With Jacob imprisoned on false charges, Whitmore could move forward with his plan to take the ranch. It was a scheme of breathtaking complexity and ruthlessness. As Three Feathers laid out the details, Jacob felt his rage building like a pressure inside his chest. He had always known that men like Whitmore and Blackthorne existed, men willing to destroy anything and anyone for profit and power. But knowing it intellectually was different from having it laid out so clearly. The danger was immediate. Three Feathers had warned him that the first false attack would come within days. The military was already moving into position. They would stage an assault on a settler's ranch about 15 miles to the north, burning it and making it appear that Indians had done it. The settlers, a family named Henderson who had been friendly to Jacob, would be killed. Then the blame would fall on the Cheyenne, and the conflict would escalate from there. Jacob had thanked Three Feathers and offered him hospitality, which the scout had accepted. Together, over that night and into the next day, they had developed a plan. It was risky, perhaps foolish, but it was the only chance Jacob could see to prevent this catastrophe and protect what was his. The plan centered on exposing the truth before the machinery of deception could start moving. Jacob needed to gather proof of Whitmore's scheme, evidence that would be undeniable even to a corrupt government. But he needed to do it quickly, before the false attack on the Henderson ranch occurred. Three Feathers had provided Jacob with names and locations. There were documents in Blackthorne's office that proved the arrangement between the general and Whitmore. There were telegrams in Whitmore's business office in the nearest town that discussed the timing and details of the plan. If Jacob could obtain these documents, he could bring them to the territorial governor, a man named David Patterson who, despite his many flaws, was known to be incorruptible when it came to threats against the integrity of the government. But stealing documents from a general and a railroad magnate was not a simple task. Both men had security, both had servants and employees who were loyal to them, and both would be quick to respond if they realized their scheme had been discovered. One wrong move could result in Jacob being arrested, killed, or worse. Jacob had spent the last 48 hours preparing for what he knew would be the most dangerous operation of his life. He had written letters explaining everything, letters to be delivered only if something happened to him. He had made arrangements with Three Feathers and his scouts to watch the Henderson Ranch and try to prevent the attack if possible, though they both knew the odds were against them. He had gathered supplies and equipment, including clothing that would allow him to move in darkness unnoticed. And he had waited for nightfall, for the moment when he would have to leave the safety of his ranch and venture into territory that belonged to men who would kill him without hesitation if they discovered who he was and what he was attempting to do. Now, as the sun sank below the horizon and darkness began to spread across the prairie, Jacob prepared to leave. He had told his ranch hands that he was going into town and would be back in 2 days. They had no reason to suspect anything unusual. Jacob often made trips to town for supplies and business. They would be surprised by his urgency, but they wouldn't question him. He dressed in dark clothing and gathered a small pack containing the tools he would need. Three Feathers had provided him with sketches of both locations, drawings made from memory that showed the layout of the buildings and the typical positions of guards. They weren't perfect, but they were better than nothing. As Jacob stepped out of the house for what might be the last time, he understood that he was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Everything he did from this moment forward was either going to save his ranch and expose a conspiracy, or it was going to result in his death or imprisonment. There was no middle ground, no safe option. But that had always been the way of Jacob McCready. He was a man who had faced down impossible odds before. He had survived in a wilderness that had killed stronger men than he was. He had built an empire from nothing. And now, at 62 years of age, when most men were thinking about retirement and peace, he was preparing for the fight of his life. He looked back at the ranch house silhouetted against the darkening sky. The lights in the windows looked warm and inviting, but they also looked fragile, as if they might extinguish at any moment. Jacob touched his hand to his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady, and he whispered a prayer to whatever forces governed this world that he would be strong enough for what was coming. Then he turned away from the house and moved toward the darkness and the unknown future that awaited him. The night air was cold and crisp as Jacob McCready moved through the darkness toward the town of Millbrook. The town was situated about 12 miles southeast of his ranch, nestled in a valley where the rail lines converged and where Whitmore maintained his business office. It was a place Jacob knew well, a place where he had conducted business for nearly 4 decades. But tonight it felt alien and dangerous, full of hidden threats and watching eyes. He had chosen to ride rather than walk, knowing that the journey would be faster and that speed was essential. Time was not his friend in this situation. The false attack on the Henderson Ranch could come at any moment, and once it did, the machinery of violence and deception would be set in motion. He had to gather the documents before that happened, before the situation spiraled into open conflict. Jacob rode carefully, staying off the main road and moving through the hills and scrubland that surrounded the valley. The route was longer and more difficult, but it meant he was less likely to be seen by anyone who might report his movements. He had arranged with Three Feathers to leave no tracks that could be followed, and he had been specific about his route in case something went wrong, and Three Feathers needed to come looking for him. As he rode through the darkness, Jacob's mind was working through the details of what lay ahead. The telegram office was located in the railway station building, which was staffed only during the day. At night, it was locked up and guarded by a single watchman, an elderly man named Robert Chen, who had worked for the railroad for 30 years. Jacob knew Chen, had even shared a drink with him on occasion. It would pain him to put the man in danger. But the documents in that office were crucial. Whitmore's business office was more of a challenge. It was located above the general store, and Whitmore maintained a small apartment there for his occasional stays in Millbrook. As far as Jacob knew, Whitmore was currently in Denver on business, but his office would be locked and possibly monitored. Whitmore was a careful man, someone who understood the value of security and maintained it meticulously. Jacob had considered and discarded a dozen different approaches to obtaining the documents. In the end, he had settled on the most straightforward method, even though it carried the greatest risk. He would break into both locations, find what he needed, and leave before anyone could raise an alarm. It was audacious and dangerous, the kind of plan that a younger man might execute without fear. But Jacob was not a young man anymore. His joints ached, his wind was not as strong as it had once been, and physical exertion tired him in ways it never had before. But age had given him something that youth lacked, which was an understanding of human nature and the way people thought. Jacob knew how guards reacted, how they moved, where they typically positioned themselves. He had learned these things through decades of living on the frontier, where security and awareness were matters of survival. He reached the outskirts of Millbrook just before midnight. The town was sleeping, lights extinguished in most of the buildings, the streets empty and silent. Jacob left his horse hidden in a small stand of trees about half a mile from the main street, securing the animal with rope and making sure it had access to water from a nearby stream. The horse would wait for him there until he returned. The railway station was his first target. It was located at the southern end of town, somewhat isolated from the main commercial buildings. Jacob moved through the darkness, staying in the shadows and keeping alert for any sign of movement. The watchman's small office was located in the eastern corner of the station building, and Jacob could see a faint light burning behind the frosted glass window. Chen was awake, which Jacob had expected. Watchmen usually were, especially on the night shift. The challenge was getting past him without causing injury or trauma that would result in an immediate alarm being raised. Jacob had considered various approaches, including simply confronting Chen and explaining the situation, but he had rejected that idea. Chen was loyal to the railroad, and even if he sympathized with Jacob's cause, he wouldn't risk his job and possibly his life by helping. What Jacob needed was a distraction, something that would draw Chen away from his post without making him suspicious. He had prepared for this possibility by acquiring several objects from his ranch. Now he removed one of them from his pack, a metal object that he threw with considerable force toward the far side of the rail yard. The object struck a steel rail with a loud clang that echoed across the empty space. Chen's reaction was immediate and exactly what Jacob had hoped for. The old man stood up from his desk, grabbed a lantern, and moved toward the noise, presumably to investigate what had caused it. Jacob moved quickly now, no longer concerned with stealth, his focus entirely on speed. He reached the office door, tried the handle, and found it locked. He had anticipated this and came prepared with tools that Three Feathers had provided, simple but effective instruments designed for opening locks. Jacob's hands were shaking slightly as he worked the lock, aware that he had only minutes before Chen would return, realized the noise had been a false alarm, and returned to his post. The lock gave way after perhaps 90 seconds, which felt like an eternity to Jacob but was actually far quicker than he had dared hope. He slipped into the office and began searching. The telegraph operator's desk was covered with papers and forms. Jacob moved quickly through them, looking for the specific message that Three Feathers had described. A telegram detailing the coordination between Whitmore and Blackthorn. A message dated 3 days ago, addressed to General Blackthorn and signed with Whitmore's business credentials. The message referenced the operation and included specific dates and details about military movements. It was exactly what Jacob needed. Proof that connected the two men in this conspiracy. He folded the telegram carefully and placed it in his pack, then moved toward the filing cabinets that lined the wall. According to Three Feathers, there would be copies of official-looking orders that appeared to come from the military, but were actually written by Whitmore's men. Finding these in Whitmore's office would prove that the orders were fabricated. Jacob was searching through the second file cabinet when he heard Chen's footsteps approaching. The watchman was coming back, moving more slowly now, probably convinced that the noise had been nothing more than an animal or wind moving debris around the rail yard. Jacob froze, his hand still buried in the files, aware that he had run out of time. The footsteps grew louder. Chen was about to reach the office door. Jacob quickly withdrew his hand from the file cabinet and moved toward the corner of the room, pressing himself into the shadow beside a tall cabinet. It wasn't much of a hiding spot, but it was the best he could do under the circumstances. Chen opened the door and stepped inside. Jacob held his breath, aware that the slightest sound or movement would give away his position. The old watchman looked around the office, apparently noticing nothing amiss. He seemed to be slightly annoyed at having been disturbed for no apparent reason. He returned to his desk, sat down, and picked up a newspaper that he had apparently been reading before the distraction. Jacob waited, allowing several minutes to pass while Chen settled back into his routine. Once he was confident that the watchman's attention was no longer acute, Jacob began moving toward the door, moving with careful, measured steps that made no sound. He was almost to the door when his foot struck something on the floor, a metal object that rolled slightly with a soft clink. It was nothing more than a small tool that must have been dropped at some point, but to Jacob's ears it sounded like an explosion. Chen's head snapped up, his eyes fixed on the door, and his hand moved toward a revolver that hung in a holster on the back of his chair. Jacob didn't wait to see if Chen would actually draw the weapon. Instead, he bolted from the office and ran into the darkness, moving as quickly as his aging body would allow. Behind him, he heard Chen's shout and the sound of the watchman giving chase. But Chen was in his late 60s, if Jacob remembered correctly, and probably not as fast or agile as he had been in his younger years. Jacob had a head start and speed on his side, even if his stamina was questionable. He ran through the dark streets of Millbrook, trusting his memory of the town layout to guide him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest with an intensity that frightened him slightly. He was too old for this kind of exertion, and his body was protesting every second of the sprint. But fear and adrenaline pushed him onward. He could hear Chen shouting behind him, calling for help, and Jacob knew that within minutes, other people would be awake and searching. He had to reach Whitmore's office and get out of town before a full alarm could be raised. The building above the general store loomed in front of him. The ground floor was dark and locked. The upper floor, where Whitmore maintained his office and apartment, also dark. Jacob moved to the rear of the building where a set of stairs led up to a back entrance. These stairs were also locked, but Jacob made short work of the lock using his tools. He climbed the stairs quickly, his legs burning with the effort, and tried the door at the top. This lock took longer, perhaps because his hands were shaking from the exertion and adrenaline, but eventually it gave way, and he was inside Whitmore's office. The office was exactly as Jacob had expected, elegantly furnished and decorated in a manner that reflected the wealth and power of the man who occupied it. Filing cabinets lined one wall, a massive desk dominated the center of the room, and various artifacts and paintings hung on the walls, all of them clearly expensive. Jacob moved directly to the filing cabinets and began searching. He had perhaps 5 minutes before someone arrived to investigate Chen's shouts. Perhaps less if people had heard the watchman's calls for help and responded quickly. He needed to work fast. The cabinet marked Operations seemed most promising. Jacob yanked it open and began going through the files with desperate speed, looking for anything that referenced the false attack plan or the conspiracy with Blackthorne. His fingers flew through the folders, scattering papers in his haste. Then he found it, a file marked Private Correspondence that contained a series of letters between Whitmore and Blackthorne. The letters were detailed and explicit, describing the plan in its entirety. There were references to specific sums of money being paid to Blackthorne in exchange for the general's cooperation. There were notes about the timing of the false attacks and the expected outcome. But more importantly, there was a letter in Blackthorne's handwriting that outlined what he called the McCready situation. The letter discussed how to frame Jacob for selling horses to hostile Indians, how to ensure that he would be arrested and imprisoned. It was all laid out clearly, a plan within the plan, a conspiracy layered upon a conspiracy. Jacob quickly removed several pages from the files, including the most damning of the letters. He was about to leave when he heard voices and footsteps on the stairs outside. People were coming, running up toward the office. Jacob looked around quickly, searching for another exit. There was a window that led to a fire escape, an external staircase designed for emergency evacuation. He moved toward it quickly and was about to open it when he heard someone trying the lock on the office door. "It's locked!" someone shouted from outside. "Whitmore's office is locked!" "Break it down," another voice commanded. It sounded like the local sheriff, a man named Garrett, who was known to be both competent and incorruptible. Jacob didn't wait to watch the door being broken down. He opened the window, climbed through, and descended the fire escape as quickly as he could manage. He could hear the sound of the office door being forced open just as his feet touched the ground below. He ran through the darkness, heading toward the location where he had left his horse. Behind him, he could hear shouts as people realized that whoever had broken into Whitmore's office had escaped. But by then, Jacob was already moving into the shadows between buildings, keeping low, and moving quickly but carefully. He reached his horse 20 minutes later, breathing hard and sweating despite the cold night air. The documents were safely tucked in his pack, proof of the conspiracy that would destroy Whitmore and Blackthorne. But Jacob was also aware that everything had changed. They would know now that someone was aware of their plan. They would suspect him, would move to either capture or kill him before he could reveal what he knew. He had perhaps until dawn to reach Governor Patterson in the territorial capital and present him with the evidence. After that, all hell would break loose. Whitmore and Blackthorne would either arrest him or they would ensure that he died in an apparent accident. Either way, his life as he had known it was over. Jacob mounted his horse and began riding toward the north, toward the territorial capital, toward the moment of truth that would determine not only his fate, but the fate of an entire region. The ride to the territorial capital at Denver was a brutal test of Jacob McCready's endurance and will. He had 60 miles to cover in what remained of the night and the following day, and he knew that pursuers would be coming behind him. Whitmore and Blackthorne would have realized by now what had happened, and would have dispatched men to stop him before he could reach the governor. Jacob pushed his horse hard, harder than was probably safe given the animal's fatigue and the darkness of the terrain, but he was driven by a clarity of purpose that transcended physical limitations. He had spent the last 3 days preparing for this moment, had risked his freedom and his life to obtain the evidence that he now carried. Failure was not an option he could afford to contemplate. The landscape blurred beneath him as he rode through the night, following trails that he had traveled many times before but that seemed more treacherous now in the darkness. His aged body protested with every jolt and impact, every muscle crying out in pain and exhaustion. But Jacob had endured pain before, had pushed through fatigue and fear in ways that most men couldn't imagine. The frontier had taught him to value survival above comfort, to keep moving regardless of the cost. Dawn broke over the prairie with shades of orange and pink, painting the sky in colors so beautiful, but Jacob found himself pausing for a moment to appreciate them. He hadn't slept in over 30 hours, and his mind was beginning to play tricks on him, showing him images that weren't there, and making his thoughts feel sluggish and disconnected, but he couldn't afford to slow down. He had perhaps 20 miles left to reach Denver, and behind him he could see dust in the distance that suggested riders in pursuit. Whitmore and Blackthorne had moved quickly, exactly as Jacob had expected they would. They would understand the threat that he represented, and would move to eliminate it. Jacob's horse was beginning to fail. The animal's breathing had become labored, and there was a slight stumble in its gait that suggested exhaustion and possibly injury. Jacob knew he should stop and rest the animal, perhaps even abandon it and try to proceed on foot, but he also knew that his pursuers were close enough now that stopping would mean capture. He made a decision born of desperation. Instead of continuing directly toward Denver, he veered northeast, heading toward the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. The terrain would be more difficult for his pursuers to navigate, and the possibility of losing them in the mountain passes was higher than if he continued on the open prairie. The detour would cost him time, but if it meant evading his pursuers long enough to reach the governor, it would be worth it. Jacob's mind was calculating variables at a level that seemed almost superhuman given his exhausted state, as if the importance of his mission had kicked his conscious mind into a higher gear of function. The foothills rose before him, a jagged barrier of rock and pine that promised both safety and danger in equal measure. Jacob entered them without hesitation, following animal trails and abandoned paths that wound through the landscape in directions that seemed random to the untrained eye, but that Jacob understood through years of experience in similar terrain. Behind him, his pursuers entered the foothills as well, but they were moving more cautiously, aware that these mountains could be dangerous and that the trails were narrow and exposed to rock slides and other hazards. Jacob's knowledge of this land gave him an advantage that he fully exploited, but the advantage had a limit. As the sun climbed higher in the sky and Jacob's exhaustion deepened, he realized that he was not going to be able to outrun his pursuers indefinitely. They were younger, their horses fresher, and they had numbers on their side. Eventually, they would catch him, and when they did, they would likely kill him rather than take him prisoner. Jacob made a new calculation. He was perhaps 10 miles from Denver now, and his pursuers were probably no more than 5 miles behind him. If he could buy himself some time enough for one of those miles of distance to shrink down to nothing while he covered the other 5, he might make it. But how could he do that? The answer came to him as he rounded a bend in a mountain trail and saw a narrow pass ahead of him, a gap between 2 rock formations that was barely wider than a horse. On the other side of the pass, the trail descended steeply into a canyon that was so deep and dark that it seemed to swallow light itself. Jacob didn't hesitate. He urged his exhausted horse toward the narrow pass and they squeezed through it, the rock formations scraping against his legs and the horse's flanks. For a moment, he was certain that they would get stuck, that the pass was too narrow and they were too large to fit through. But with a final lunge, Jacob and his horse pushed through and emerged on the other side. The descent into the canyon was precipitous and dangerous. Jacob had to dismount and lead the horse down the steep slope, moving carefully over loose rocks and hidden obstacles. It was slow going, far slower than his pursuers had been moving, but it was also a descent that would be nearly impossible for his pursuers to follow at speed. He was halfway down into the canyon when he heard gunshots from above. His pursuers had reached the narrow pass and had realized that they couldn't follow him through it. Instead, they were trying to shoot him from their elevated position, firing down into the canyon in hopes of hitting him or causing a rock slide that would bury him. Jacob pressed himself against the rock wall and urged his horse to move faster, awareness of danger and survival instinct overriding his exhaustion. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around him, and one bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing through the fabric of his jacket and drawing blood. But the wound was superficial, and Jacob didn't let it slow him down. He reached the bottom of the canyon and swung himself into the saddle despite his aching muscles and the wound in his shoulder. The canyon descended further, following a narrow stream that emerged from a hidden source deep in the mountains. Jacob followed the stream, trusting that it would eventually lead him to lower ground and open territory. Behind and above him, his pursuers were trying to find another way around the mountain, searching for a trail that would allow them to descend without the terrible hazards of the canyon Jacob had chosen. It would take them time that Jacob needed, and that every second of delay brought him closer to safety. The canyon walls slowly began to open, the darkness giving way to light as the terrain transformed. Jacob emerged from the mountains onto open land, and before him, perhaps 5 miles away, he could see Denver. The territorial capital sprawled across the prairie, buildings and structures that represented civilization and safety. Jacob's horse was nearly dead from exhaustion by the time he reached the governor's compound. The animal's breathing was shallow and irregular, and its legs were shaking from effort and strain. But they had made it, and that was all that mattered. Governor David Patterson was in his office when Jacob burst through the doors. The governor's security personnel tried to stop the wild-looking, blood-stained man who was clearly not part of the usual visitors to the governor's compound, but Patterson held up his hand, recognizing Jacob immediately. "McCready," Patterson said, rising from his desk, "what in God's name has happened to you?" Jacob was beyond formalities. He collapsed into a chair and thrust the documents toward the governor. His hands shaking from exhaustion, and the adrenaline that had been sustaining him was beginning to crash. He told Patterson everything, laying out the conspiracy in explicit detail, connecting Whitmore and Blackthorne and their plans to steal land, manipulate the military, and destroy anyone who stood in their way. Patterson read through the documents carefully, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and stared at Jacob for a long moment. "This is treason," Patterson said quietly. "What you're describing is conspiracy against the territorial government, conspiracy to commit fraud and deception, and conspiracy to commit murder. These are the gravest crimes. If what these documents say is true, it will shake this territory to its foundations. This is true, and it's still happening. They're planning to attack a settler's family as a false flag operation. The attack could come at any moment. We have to stop it." Patterson was already moving, calling for his assistance and issuing rapid orders. He sent military messengers to intercept the forces that Blackthorne had positioned to carry out the false attack. He issued orders for Whitmore and Blackthorne's arrests. He convened an emergency session of the Territorial Council and demanded that they hear the evidence immediately. What followed was chaos and confusion as the implications of the conspiracy rippled out through the territorial government. Military forces were mobilized, investigations were launched, and the entire structure that Whitmore and Blackthorne had tried to build began to collapse under the weight of exposure. Whitmore tried to flee but was apprehended before he could leave the territory. Blackthorne attempted to organize a military response, trying to use his position as general to protect himself, but Patterson removed him from command and placed him under arrest. Other government officials and business figures who had been connected to the conspiracy were exposed and held accountable. The false attack on the Henderson Ranch never came. The military forces that Blackthorne had positioned to carry it out were recalled and repurposed. The settler family that had been marked for destruction lived on, unaware of how close they had come to death. But the consequences of the conspiracy extended far beyond Whitmore and Blackthorne. The documents that Jacob had risked his life to obtain revealed a complex web of corruption that extended into multiple aspects of territorial government. Investigations that followed from Patterson's action uncovered fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power that had been hidden for years. Three Feathers and the Cheyenne people received formal recognition from Governor Patterson that they had been falsely targeted as part of a conspiracy. Reparations were offered, and the territorial government pledged to honor the treaty agreements with the Cheyenne Nation. It was not a perfect resolution, but it was far better than the alternative that would have come if Whitmore and Blackthorn's plan had succeeded. Jacob recovered from his wound and the ordeal of the escape. Governor Patterson officially commended him for his actions in exposing the conspiracy, and McCready Ranch was secured from any further threats from Whitmore or his associates. But there was one moment, one final moment, that crystallized the entire experience into a single memory that Jacob would carry with him for the rest of his life. It came during the trial of Charles Whitmore, which was held in the territorial capital about 4 months after the escape from Denver. Jacob was called to testify, and he described the events that had led him to steal the documents. Whitmore was present in the courtroom, seated behind a desk with his lawyers, his expression cold and controlled even as his world fell apart around him. When Jacob had finished his testimony and was being excused from the stand, Whitmore requested that he be allowed to speak. The judge granted the request, and Whitmore stood, regarding Jacob with an expression that was almost impossible to read. "You have destroyed me," Whitmore said, his voice steady and measured. "You have taken everything that I built and reduced it to ashes. I spent decades constructing an empire, and you have torn it down in a matter of weeks." Jacob looked back at him, meeting his gaze directly. In that moment, Jacob understood something fundamental about power and authority in the world. Whitmore's power had been built on control and fear, on the ability to manipulate others through influence and threats. But it had been built on a foundation of deception and corruption. Jacob's power, by contrast, had come from truth. He had risked everything to expose the conspiracy, had put his life in danger to bring the documents to light, and that power had proven to be far stronger than anything Whitmore had built. "You were going to destroy me," Jacob said quietly. "And you were going to destroy others as well. You were going to destroy a peaceful people and use them as cover for your greed. I simply chose to fight back." Whitmore's expression changed for just a moment, and in that moment Jacob saw something like recognition, an acknowledgement of the truth in what Jacob had said. Then the moment passed, and Whitmore's expression hardened again, but the damage had been done. The trial concluded 2 weeks later, with a guilty verdict. Whitmore was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Blackthorn received a life sentence for his crimes against the territorial government. Other conspirators received varying sentences based on the extent of their involvement. Jacob McCready returned to his ranch to find that it had been maintained in his absence by his loyal workers. The ranch was still his, the water rights still belonged to his family, and the cattle were still healthy and productive. He had saved everything that mattered to him, not through violence or corruption, but through courage and a willingness to risk everything for the truth. He lived for another 15 years after the trial, watching his daughter eventually come back to the ranch and learning to appreciate the legacy that her father had preserved. When Jacob finally passed away in 1902, he was remembered not just as a successful rancher, but as a man who had stood against corruption and won, a man who had proven that truth and courage could triumph over power and greed. The McCready Ranch continued to operate for another 70 years before eventually being purchased by the territorial government and preserved as a historical site. The story of Jacob McCready and the conspiracy he exposed became part of frontier legend, told and retold in different versions, but always with the core truth intact. The story of an old rancher who refused to be intimidated and who risked everything to expose a dangerous conspiracy. And on quiet nights when the wind blew across the prairie where the ranch had stood, people said you could almost hear the sound of a horse's hooves moving through the darkness, carrying an old man with documents that would change the course of history. The sound was a ghost, some said, the ghost of Jacob McCready, still riding toward justice, still carrying truth into the light.